I'm not saying I'm an expert on this. I've just done an awful lot of them. And to be clear, I'm focusing on giving a technical talk. If you were giving a talk to a general audience, you would change some of the things that I'm going to say here. In particular, you would probably simplify the presentation, both technically, of course, but also in terms of just it visually. When you're giving a technical talk, there's a slightly higher expectation for how much is actually physically on the slide. All right. When you're making a talk, one of the things you want to do, and once again, this is for a technical talk, is you sort of want to spoil the talk. I like to start with a quad chart first thing where you basically communicate all the main points of the talk. And I will stress this over and over again. Make the main point the first bullet. Put what you're trying to communicate in the upper left-hand part of the slide, because that's just the way we work. We start in the upper left and work across, work down. So make the main point that first bullet. If a person walked away and they only saw one thing from that slide, you want it to be that first bullet. You want them to know what that main point was. And of course, you want to tell an interesting story. There are various things you can do to do that, but one key thing is to not tell the story of all the things you tried and the path you took. You want to think about the technical story you want to tell. What is interesting technically? You need to set the context for it. People don't know what you're talking about, what the details are, what the background is. So you need to set that up. I am a big fan of employing cartoons in that simple diagrams, simple plots, something which conveys the main point at a high level with the minimum amount of graphics is incredibly useful because people pick that up very quickly, much better than reading your words. And you want to make all the graphics clear and easy to read. So a clear chart will have a structure which emphasizes, once again, the main point, has those cartoons, has the other contributing components to it. Let me go over my outline for talking about talks. Do a quick overview, talk about outlines, give some basic slide layouts, and then talk a little bit more about cartoons and graphics. Just at the very high level, you need to understand who your audience is. And this can be complicated when your audience is mixed. But at least if you know your audience, you can tune your talk to what you expect their understanding is. You need to think about how long your talk is. If you're doing a good job, you're spending enough time on each slide, it's going to be about a minute and a half to maybe 2 minutes per slide. Now, some slides aren't real slides in that you don't count them because you're just going to flip by them. Sometimes outline slides turn into that. Sometimes it's just to refresh the viewer's memory from something earlier in the talk, and you're not going to spend time on it, just to remind them that we're going to talk about this again. But for the serious technical slides, you want to spend sort of a minute and a half to 2 minutes on the slide, depending on how much there actually is on the slide. And invariably, when graduate students start, they build a talk where they would have to give it at 30 seconds a slide. It just doesn't end up being a good talk when you do it that way, for a couple of reasons. One is you're just rushing to get through. And two, as someone who is just viewing the talk, you spend most of your time listening to the person giving the talk and actually looking at them, although clearly when you're recording a talk like this, it's maybe a little bit different. So that you're not spending that much time actually reading all the bullets. It takes maybe 30 seconds to sort of read the main bullets. If you stay on the slide for only like 15 seconds, then of course they can't actually get through getting to your main points. Of course, you should practice your talk. You should practice your talk standing up. No one wants to hear you say And now, to be fair, we all say and we all pause and we all think about what we're going to say. That's fine because we're not in the communication school. We're not held to that standard. However, if you force yourself, and you have to there's some energy to do this, if you force yourself to actually stand up, give the talk a couple times in your room, talking to the wall, it will make you think about the phrases you need to say. And often when you're just going to give a talk, it takes a second to actually get the phrases that you need to form in your head. And if it's the first time you gave it, or your first time you're saying that out loud, it will take longer and you spend more time saying So it's a silly thing. It's obvious, but we often try to avoid it. So practice your talks. And of course, you need to be able to see the fonts, so use big, bold fonts. So why are you giving this talk? And it sounds silly, but often people don't provide enough background or context. It does depend on where you're giving the talk. If you're giving a talk and you're the fifth talk in a special session on a topic, you don't need to spend a lot of time setting context, but you still need to do a little bit. As an example, I've given lots of talks on multiple input, multiple output radar. So so-called MIMO radar, when people say that, they can mean one of several different things. And so if you don't start your talk, and you might be in a special session on MIMO radar, if you don't start your talk by basically saying, yeah, these are different types of MIMO radar, and I'm going to be focusing on this particular kind, then they may spend the first 30 of your talk trying to figure out which kind of MIMO radar you're talking about. Even when it's narrow, based on context, you still need to spend some energy just letting people know what you're going to be talking about. You need to motivate it, of course. It is often very easy. There's a reason why you're going down this path, but if you don't know why your talk is important, then you really do need to sit there and think about it for a minute, because you've just worked hard. You worked hard enough to actually get enough research done that you're going to give a talk at a conference or to a group of people. Why should they care? And you should know why you care. So key thing is, if you succeed, if everything works out, who's going to benefit? What does this mean in the broader context? And of course, in an academic environment, you need to spend some energy placing it in terms of the research literature. Depending on the audience, this may be a very important or a minor thing. So you need to pay attention to the audience. But you typically do want to say, well, so-and-so did this research, which is similar to what I'm talking about, but it's different in this way. And when you have a main point, when there's something going on you care about, you need to repeat it. Particularly now, fortunately or unfortunately, however you want to view it, people are less focused on what you're saying, and they will get lost. And you will say to yourself in preparing to talk, well, I explained that 5 slides ago, and I'm going to tell you half the audience has already forgotten it. So you need to sort of remind them of what's important, where you're going, where we came from. Once again, supporting this, place the main point on the top of the slide, and you want to use clear, short phrases. Once again, you don't have much time on each slide, and even if you spend enough time on it, that 1.5 to 2 minutes, if you have lots of words on the slide, people will either stop paying attention to you to start reading it, or they won't read it, in which case it didn't matter that was there. Because we're writing these slides in terms of phrases, you typically don't need punctuation. Periods at the end of sentences aren't necessary because you typically don't use full sentences, so you can drop the periods. If there are commas to separate phrases, you still want to keep those. It's valuable to start the main bullets with verbs. So I will typically do this. I will typically start each main bullet with a verb. And if you practice doing that, you will find that you can actually convey things which originally were long sentences with just a few words. And there is a lot of value to that because, once again, it's all about efficiency and time. You don't have a lot of time on the slide. The person who's viewing this doesn't have a lot of time to actually read it. So you would like to be able to convey the main ideas as quickly as possible. And if you start with verbs, it's just faster. Having said that, I don't mind if the sub-bullets don't have verbs. It's just the main bullets you want to have verbs. The sub-bullets are, if you think about it, some phrases that modify the main phrase in each bullet. You can think of them as sort of parenthetical descriptions or something which allows you to modify or put limits on that main bullet. You want to really be careful with acronyms. I've seen this many times where somebody is giving a talk, and even when I'm in the area, they will quickly introduce 5 acronyms at the beginning of the talk. And 2 of them I'm familiar with. One, I'm like, I think I know what that means, and 2 are just, I have no idea what he's talking about. What happens is later in the talk, they're just using those acronyms, and you have lost context. You've lost what they meant, and then the talk just doesn't make sense. So the acronyms are fine, but be very careful with them. So try not to use too many. If you're going to use an unusual acronym, try not to use more than one. Certainly don't use more than two. And of course, you need to think about your audience's knowledge of the subject. And a lot of that is about vocabulary. So for one audience, a very technical audience in your area, everybody agrees, well, I'll rephrase that. There's a reasonable amount of agreement on what various words mean. But when you're talking to a general audience, simple ideas like, what does frequency mean? Well, to engineers, it means something very specific. To a general audience, it doesn't. So you've got to be careful about the language. And just a quick note, when you are building talks early in your career, you might only have 3 or 4 talks, on your computer that are yours. You do this for a few years and you realize you have built up hundreds of talks. And you're going to really regret not having some file name structure later on, because you're going to want to search for it. You want to say, like, I gave a talk on this back in 1999. Literally, I've done this before. It was sort of on this topic. I can't remember who I gave it to. How do I find this? I actually suspect that this is useful for almost every file that you make. But it's nice to say your name, because someone else might be searching for you. If you hand your talk off to somebody, telling them that it's the Asilomar talk when you're at Asilomar is really useless. But if it has your name in it, then suddenly they go, well, they can search for it. Then you want to have something which provides an indicator of why this talk exists. So in this particular talk, it's my talk, which is our sort of joke phrase for explaining what this is. But when I search for talk on my computer, 3 files pop up, and I know where I am. And then it's nice to have a date there. So as another example, I already sort of referenced, doing some sort of Asilomar conference. I start with my name, then I say it's Asilomar, and then there's something comment that's about what the topic is. In this case, a reference to RF convergence, and then once again a date. And another one is if the audience, instead of maybe a conference, is a particular person, have the structure down here where it's my name. In this case, I had built this talk for Tom Rondeau. It was a discussion of radar metrics, and the date that was given. Notice it was sometime during that month, because that was all the resolutions I thought I needed. And then it was version 0, since I basically built multiple versions of this talk as we interacted and as we wanted to think through things. Trust me, it may not seem like this is useful right now because you only got a few slide decks, but I can guarantee you a few years from now, you're going to really wish you did this. So I would take my advice on this. All right, outlines. So you're telling a story, and you're trying to make it interesting, and there's something about the structure of the story which will make it compelling. Having said that, be careful about trying to do the ta-da sort of thing. You don't want there to be a mystery in giving the talk. Now, after you've given hundreds of talks and you want to play some games with the narrative, the structure of how you present this, that's fine. Early on, though, just spoil it. Make sure the main point and the conclusion or the resolution is always there. Then you can still do the same thing, though. There is something about, I'm going to set the context. I'm going to set up the problem, set up the model for what I'm talking about. I'm going to explain some calculation, something which is limiting my performance. I'm going to explore a few solutions, and I'm going to say these are the results. And look, it works in this context, in this regime. It works significantly better in that regime, but maybe it doesn't work so well. But that ends up being a compelling story. But once again, we've spoiled the story, to be clear. When you give talks, it's nice to have these outlines of the talk itself. So you usually want 3 to 7 sections, depending on the length. If it's a short conference talk, then 3 is probably sufficient. If it's an hour-long talk, then something like 7. If you go more than 7, then actually that's just too much for people to pay attention to. And it allows you to remind the audience of what we've talked about, where we are, and you got to remind yourself that they're not always paying attention. So, sort of having these touchstones, something where they can go, oh, okay, so now he's going to talk about this. That's useful. So as I said, they have already forgotten what they're doing. And it really is important. This is a common flaw I've seen in graduate student talks. It's hard to tell what is your contributions versus what is contributions from prior work, even though maybe you did all the work. It's hard to tell what is new and what's novel, and so you always want to make sure that you indicate what part is your contribution very clearly. Sometimes I think students think it doesn't look good maybe to focus too much on what's novel, and you don't have to like jump up and down and say, my brilliant contributions, but you do want to indicate what is your novel contribution, because otherwise people legitimately will be very confused. And I've seen this over and over again in talks about what is prior work, maybe which you duplicated, but what is prior work and what is your novel contribution. So, and you actually use these outlines, there are different ways to present the outline. And it's most commonly used just simple phrases on a bulleted list, but sometimes you might want to do it with graphics. This is actually from a talk I gave at one point on different biomedical applications, and I use a graphical representation for the outline. It was sort of an experiment. It actually worked for that particular talk. Sometimes it's nice to give outlines in the context of maybe a block diagram. So instead of having a bulleted list, you might say, well, the system works like this. I'm going to walk through the various blocks. I'm going to start with this particular block and so forth. Now we have sort of a notion of where we want to go. We've figured out who the audience is. We should spend a little bit of time just thinking about basic slide layout. And it's worth really thinking about it for a bit, because different kinds of slide layouts are good for different goals. Once again, always put your main point up the upper left. If they don't read anything else or look at anything else on your slide, hopefully the main point is there. And to be clear, this is the main point of the slide from the perspective of the story that you're telling. You can use this layout to help. The quad chart basically is good for presenting lots of information at a high level, but not with a lot of detail. The horizontally split chart is commonly used when you're actually diving into something, particularly if you have a nice plot. Obviously, split these things in other ways, depending on the nature of the problem. It's also important, and it may seem like a funny thing to think about, but it's important to think about the visual balance of the slide. I legitimately tell people to do this. It's now easier for me than it used to be, because I would say just kind of blur your eyes a little bit and look at the slide without actually being able to see the details of the slide. And if the weight is unbalanced, then you want to fix that. Now I can just take my glasses off and it becomes blurry, so that's easier for me now. But you do want to place the graphics sort of in some balanced way around it. And I mean, that's the words and everything on the slide. It just makes it more visually appealing, and people will like your talk more. And it may sound silly, but it's really true. And be careful about getting too close to the edges. You really don't want to sort of be all up against one edge and have nothing on the other side. So, give yourself a little bit of boundary around the edge. It doesn't have to be too big, but it is sort of unsettling to see text right up against the edge. It is useful to use animations to focus the audience's attention. I do this regularly. If you put a whole bunch of stuff on a slide all at once, what ends up happening is they will then go off and focus on the wrong part as you're trying to talk to them about it. But it can go the other way. If you try to overuse animations, it can be just sort of silly. And I have actually seen this in talks where you just start getting annoying. You start getting annoyed with the speaker because there's just this sort of silly, ridiculous overuse of the animation. So use it, but be aware of it can be annoying if you overuse it. All right, so let's talk a little bit about the cartoons and graphics. It really is useful to have a simple cartoon that explains the concepts. And depending on what you're doing, this can be something physical, it can be an analogy, it can be a simplified block diagram. And if you have that, then you can reuse it over and over again. You can focus on different parts. There is a little bit of a trade between how sophisticated this is and the ability of the viewer to actually understand it quickly. Depending on your problem, you got to find that right point and balance. And once you have this, then you can actually use these simple cartoons in various ways. You can do call-outs, which focus on various pieces, and you can go piece after piece, and then it actually helps immediately for someone to understand what's going on. They understand the details, they understand the context, and the simplified cartoon can be immediately understood, and that makes your talk more efficient, which is actually one of the keys. All right, I see this disturbingly often in talks. There is some slide that goes up. It has a few lines on it, sometimes several lines on it. And it can even be unlabeled, which, as someone who's viewing the talk or listening to the talk, you're sitting there trying to figure out what in the world all these different curves mean. And it's just infuriating. Any of you students who've been with me for a while know that it drives me crazy when people do this, because you can't look at the plot and actually make any sense out of this. There's no context, the labels aren't there, or just unreadable. So please make sure that when you build these things, you provide some context. So one way to do this is using that sort of horizontally split slide. You can place it in context on one side. You can tell the viewers and the listeners why it's important. And then, once again, you need to make sure that the labels and the lines are readable. The default settings for things like MATLAB are fundamentally bad. You can't use the default settings in MATLAB and actually build readable plots. You need to go in and fix it. The lines need to be thicker. What you'll often see is that when you put it up on a projector, very thin lines will disappear, or it's not clear what's going on. There are also problems with various colors. It turns out that many projectors have their contrast turned up. And so if you have a light color, like a light yellow or a light green, it will disappear because it just turns into white. So you got to be careful about that. The labels, the default labels in MATLAB are just way too small. So you need to go in and make them larger so that someone can see them. All right. And then there are equations. We give technical talks, and sometimes an important part of the talk is the equation. So as just an example here, we have Kramer-Bound equation, and you should have equations in your technical talks. So I don't want to say that you don't want to use them. You should be judicious about how you use them. If there's a result or an equation that is well known in the field and you're talking to an audience full of experts, you can put that equation up and it becomes an icon because everyone or many of the people in the room immediately recognize the equation and immediately know what it means, and frankly don't need to think about it much longer. Sometimes there is a derivation or some key point in the derivation which you think is very important and you want to stress it, so you got to put it there. But I have seen talks that were unwatchable before, where someone's going through several pages of derivations up on the slides and the details aren't that important. They just wanted to show that they could go through a fancy derivation. That's fine in the paper. That's where you want it. But in giving a talk, you really want to focus on the implications. What does it mean? And so for the Kramer-Bound, which is a bound on estimation variance, one, it's an equation that many people in our field will immediately recognize, and two, if you're trying to focus on some aspect of it, like the variance falls like 1 over the SNR, you put it up there and you can point out the various components of the equation and tell your story. I explained how to give a talk. You really want to make sure that first point on every slide conveys what it means to the overall talk. So, restate what's important. Always make sure you tie things into what else is going on. You really want to start off with a good overview of what's going on. The outline helps guide the viewer or the listener into sort of knowing how the various pieces are connected. You can leverage the slide layout to do various things, so you should sit there and think about it. And everything needs to be viewable. If you put up a bunch of graphics on the slide, but you can't see anything, then you really have to ask yourself, why did you do that? What was the point? Sometimes it's just as an icon. You might be reusing it, but if you're actually trying to convey some information with that, you have done yourself a disservice. All right, any questions?